Hello friends and welcome back to Chess with Konstantin. Today we are looking at yet another beautiful Nezh masterpiece. This one will teach you how to organize an attack with the black pieces in the Old Indian defense. Now the Old Indian defense, as the name suggests, is a defensive opening against pawn to d4 with the white pieces. And this opening emphasizes essentially building a house for your king, castling quite early, and playing moves like d6 and e5. The idea behind it is to eventually organize some kind of counterattack on the king side, and in the meantime black is going to have somewhat less space and be, I guess, slightly worse. But what Nezh was known for is actually winning more games with the black pieces against pawn to d4 than he won even with the white pieces by playing pawn to d4. So if you know what you're doing and you're quite good, then playing conservative openings such as the Old Indian defense can actually give you great attacking chances. So let's jump right into the action, and please, if you want to help this channel, don't forget to hit the like and subscribe buttons so I can make more content like this. So this game began with pawn to d4, and now we have simple continuation of knight f6, c4, and pawn to d6. This is the standard setup, kind of staying flexible, being able to open the bishop, preparing pawn to e5 as well. And after white played knight to c3, actually it's possible to play pawn to e5 right away, which is what Nezh did. It's perfectly fine to play this opening if you're playing somebody who's stronger than you, if the white player is actually stronger and you don't mind the draw. But you have to be careful, at least you have to have a plan over what would happen if you have this exchange. D takes e5, d takes e5, and then queen takes d8 check. This is actually not bad for black, and in fact black will have slightly better winning chances after this exchange. The reason being that after king takes d8, the king will find eventually refuge either on e7 or c7, depending on what white does. And because the queens are off the board, there is no immediate attack. Therefore, castling is less important. At the same time, black has kind of a long-term advantage with this pawn controlling the d4 square. And it's going to be somewhat challenging to get this pawn out of the way and actually contest this d4 square. So actually, after this exchange, it is white who is going to be slightly worse. So for example, if white goes for this fork to try to play knight f3 and knight g5, then black just plays knight to d7 here. And after knight g5, then you just play not king to e8, but actually king to e7 is even better. And this is nothing. There is no attack here from white, and the king is quite safe, as you could see. And actually black is slightly better in this position. So that was the idea behind playing e5 right away. So white played simply pawn to e4. Here you could see that white is slightly better. White does have a strong pawn center and slightly more space, but black is doing quite okay here, even though black's position is a little bit cramped. So here the game continued with pawn to c6. This is, while not the best computer recommended move, is still quite a good move. And the idea behind c6 is actually, if white were to exchange here, after takes, takes, and takes, actually you get a slightly improved position even over the earlier one as black, because this pawn on c6 actually protects these two squares. So it's impossible for the white's knight to come here and ruin the fun. So c6 is fine. It controls these squares. It prepares an eventual push to d5 if white allows it. You know, it's a very solid move. So then the game continued with knight ge2, developing the knight, knight to d7, and now d5, not allowing black to try to play for d5 himself. So we have c takes d5, c takes d5, and now notice that after this pawn was pushed, now we have a very nice outpost square for our knight to come to c5 as black. This is a very common theme in the old Indian system, and if you can get your knight safely to c5, it's usually a good idea to do so as the dark player with the dark pieces. So the game continued pawn to g6, simply with the idea to have your typical build your house for the king setup, and then the bishop will come to usually to g7, followed by castle. The king will be quite safe, and then black will try to look for opportunities to organize the attack on the king side. White should also look at castling in this position, but white decided to play very aggressively. So white went ahead and played pawn to f3. So the point of pawn to f3, and it's actually an idea that's borrowed from the Sicilian, is to organize basically a variant of the Yugoslav attack from the Sicilian dragon variations. So white will play bishop to d3, queen to d2, with the idea to trade off these bishops, and then organize a pawn storm on the king side with g4, h4, and h5, to try to get the queen here on h6, open up the h-file, and simply try to go for checkmate on this open h-file. But as you can see, this plan is quite involved and quite long and complex, and it's going to require a lot of moves from white. And while those moves are happening, of course, black is not going to be standing still. So it's not that easy to proceed with such a plan. So the game continued simply with the idea of bishop to g7 from Mr. Neshmadinov. He is ready to castle and then start thinking about attacking himself. And then we have bishop to e3, castle, and now it's a very common idea for black to play for moves like knight to h5 followed by f5 to try to get a semi-open file for this rook. And the knight, after the, if pawn takes, and the knight can actually come back to f6 or to f4. So this idea of knight h5 and f5 is a very common theme. I want you to remember it. It's a very good way to try to make something happen on the king side once your king is safe. So white continued with his attacking plan with queen to d2. Then we had the move knight to c5. And here, ladies and gentlemen, white actually played b4, trying to kick the knight off that active square right away. But I want you to pause the video and try to find the reason why the move bishop to h6 doesn't work here. So why couldn't have white continued with his original plan to play bishop h6 and trade these bishops? And I will give you a couple of seconds if you want to pause the video and think about that. Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen. If you found it, great job. If not, I will show you now why this move doesn't work. So if bishop h6, then we have the spectacular knight sacrifice, knight takes e4. and it doesn't really matter whether it's captured back with the pawn or the knight, because after this, the point of this move is that we have this move with the queen, spectacular check that also is looking and setting up a double attack on black's bishop. And after a block, and it doesn't really matter how that's blocked, then we have queen takes h6. Now black is just completely winning. Black is up a pawn. He will threaten to trade queens and go into just a winning endgame where black has a pair of very active bishops. I mean, this is an easily won endgame. And I actually want you to, if you do have the time and have a chessboard at home, go ahead and set up this position at home on your chessboard and try to win. Try to play for both white and black and kind of see how much better black's position is in such a situation. So this is the reason why white didn't go for bishop h6 here, but instead played pawn to b4, simply attacking the knight and forcing it to move. This is not a bad move, and the knight, of course, came back to d7. You don't want to. You don't really have any other good options. And then notice white's position here. So white's king is still in the middle, and it's quite vulnerable. And white also hasn't completed his development. His bishop, white squared bishop, is still in its initial square. So when you have a situation like this, from a strategic standpoint, as the person who is playing white, you should be thinking about how should I castle, how should I complete my development, what is a good square for me to put my white squared bishop on, right? You should be thinking about these plans. What you should not be doing is you shouldn't be thinking about how to capture pawns and how to begin an attack. And this is actually a very common mistake that even some expert and master level players will make. But this is not a mistake that my students will make if you signed up for this channel and looked at my course, The Fun of Attack, because that course talks about why organizing premature attacks before you complete development are a bad idea. But here, of course, the player playing Nashmadinov as white has never heard of my channel and wasn't a subscriber, so he played knight to b5. Trying to gobble up this pawn. This is a mistake. Despite what the computer will tell you, trying to attack prematurely is definitely a mistake. It wastes time. So black played a simple move here, knight to b6. This move develops the knight to a new square, opens up the white squared bishop, which by the way is just fine on c8, unlike white's counterpart, and also very importantly protects the pawn on b6. So of course here white continued the attack with knight e to c3, and now black engaged in a common Indian defense idea that I showed you earlier, knight to h5, simply with the thought of playing f5 next. So you may be wondering, why can't white simply play g4 and go with his original attacking idea of g4, h4, h5? Why can't we just kick this knight out with this g4? Well, simply because if g4, then black can just play knight f4, putting the knight on a very strong outpost. But Constantine, you might think, white has two attacking pieces on this knight, and there's only one defender, so doesn't this drop a pawn? Well, yes, it does. But look what happens if white gets too greedy and tries to get it. So if takes and pawn takes, this bishop is now opened up. And there is a tremendous X-ray attack on this rook. The bishop suddenly goes from controlling 4 squares to controlling this whole entire diagonal. And this is a very, very serious mistake, and if white goes on to take the pawn anyway, then simply the move a6, forcing this defending knight to move, will lose the game, because of the fork, threatened fork. Bishop takes c3 check. This threat really cannot be defended, and white will shortly lose a piece, one of these pieces. So the idea with g4 doesn't work because of knight to f4, and therefore white didn't try to play g4. Instead, white played queen to f2. Now this move is a pretty good move. It does allow h4, I mean knight to f4, but after knight f4, then you have move like g3, and the knight will be kicked away. But the idea is deeper than that. So the idea is now you have a double attack on this knight, and the threat is actually knight takes a7, seemingly sacrificing the knight, but it's not a real sacrifice, because after knight takes a7, if rook captures on a7, then simply bishop takes b6, and you recapture the piece, and now you're pawn up, and there's a nice fork for the queen and the rook. So actually you would be losing the exchange as well, as black, if you were to capture that pawn. I mean, you capture that knight. So this is the threat. The threat is knight takes a7 here. But you know, it's not that serious of a threat, because as I said earlier, material advantage is not that important in situations where your opponent still hasn't castled and still hasn't completed development. So in fact, black doesn't mind if white captures this pawn, or even if white captures two pawns, as long as black can maintain his momentum and proceed with the attack. So rather than trying to do some kind of defensive move, maybe most of you, I think, would play a pawn to a6 here and lose this piece, or try to move the knight and lose this pawn. You know, as the player playing black, you should consider that you have a fight for initiative, and if you can try to attack, then you don't mind if your opponent gobbles up material. So here Nashmadinov continued with the idea of f5, creating a semi-open file for the rook, and this is going to be a field of a very strong attack later on. And white doesn't believe in black's attack, so he went ahead and, oops, my bad, white took this pawn on a7. And of course you don't want to take here with the rook, because again bishop takes b6 with the fork on queen and the rook. So simply knight to d7 was played, and now knight a to b5, coming back with the knight and threatening to gobble up another pawn. Notice white is already a pawn up, but you know, does white really have time to do something like that? Because here we already have a semi-open file for the rook, and the rook is already kind of indirectly looking at the queen here. So black proceeded to open up this file with f takes e4, and knight takes e4 of course followed, and then we had knight to d to f6, threatening, by the way, knight takes e4 with the pin on the queen. So of course black decided to gobble up pawn number 2 and protect this knight. And I want you to understand why it was impossible here to play bishop to g5 instead, with the pin on the queen here. So go ahead and pause the video again for about 15 to 20 seconds, 30 seconds, and try to find the reason why bishop to g5 with the spin doesn't work. I'll give you a couple seconds. Welcome back. So the reason is, of course, the spectacular move knight takes e4 anyway. You don't care about the attack on the queen because black himself is attacking white's queen. And so after bishop takes d8 and knight takes f2, actually, if you count the pieces now, white only has 3 minor pieces, black has 4 minor pieces. And so black is up a piece, and regardless of whether this bishop moves, for example, you can try, bishop to b6, but then the rook is hanging. Or if you try to capture the knight, but then, the bishop gets captured. In the end, or you can move the bishop, but the rook, gets captured. There is really no good move here for white to overcome this material advantage. And white will be going into the endgame a piece down. So that's the reason why bishop g5 was a poor move. So white, instead of bishop to g5, which runs into knight takes e4, white went ahead and tried for gobbling up another pawn. So the game continued. Knight takes e4, knight takes e4, of course, and now simply bishop to f5 with the threat to take this knight. Again, recapturing with the pawn is impossible because of the spin. So white doesn't really want to move this knight if he can help it. Moving a piece too many times loses time. So white plays the logical move, bishop to d3, protecting the knight and also developing his bishop and preparing possibly to castle. But already there isn't enough time for that, because black continues the attack with rook to a3. Now if white castles, the bishop will be hanging, and really this bishop has to be protected somehow. So moves like rook to d1 do not work. The reason being that simply you have the sacrifice of the rook at rook takes d3, and after rook takes back to d3, then just capturing the knight, and again it cannot be recaptured, and black actually gets 2 minor pieces for a rook here, which is a big advantage in the endgame. So that's why after rook to a3, because rook d1 doesn't work and castling doesn't work, white instead retreated the bishop to c2, which is a very logical move. You want to keep your protection here, and you are no longer being threatened. But black can just continue the attack, which is exactly what happened in the game. First, bishop captured on e4, and now we had the move bishop to b6. So you might be asking, why not just recapture here on e4? Well, the reason why recapturing doesn't work is simply black will play knight to f6 with the threat to capture the bishop, and obviously recapture isn't possible because of the spin. So really the only logical move here is to move the queen. And so after the queen moves out of this of the spin, for example queen e2, then we have knight takes e4, pawn takes e4, and finally queen to h4 with check and an attack on this e-pawn. And if move like bishop to f2 is played, attacking the queen, then, ladies and gentlemen, and I want you to remember this idea very carefully, you can have the rook sacrifice, positional rook sacrifice idea. Rook takes f2. The idea behind this move is that you won't win immediately, but you have a long-term positional advantage going into the endgame. So what I mean by that is, just look at this position. After rook takes and queen takes, you don't want to trade queens. Instead, queen takes e4 check. And now what to do? The king has to run away. You don't really want to come here because you run into potential difficulties with being out in the open with the long king. So the king has to come to f1. And now notice, because white didn't take the opportunity to castle earlier in the game, yes, in this position white has two rooks and black has a bishop and a rook. So technically speaking, white is up in exchange. But this rook is never coming out. I mean, it's going to take at least 2-3 moves to put it on an active square. And in a position like this, 3 moves is a very long time. So for all practical purposes, right now, for the next several moves, white will be playing without a rook. So actually it is black that's a piece up here. Because unlike white's rook, black's bishop can be quite active. After this pawn gets pushed, actually this bishop will be a monster. So I encourage you to take this position and set it up on your chessboard at home. Go ahead and pause the video to do that, whatever you need to do. But I do encourage you, if you have time, go ahead and try to play either side of this position, either as black or as white. Maybe even practice against the computer, set it up on chess.com, and you will see just how much stronger the black's side is here, despite being an exchange down. So for example, here you can just continue with the move rook to a8, with the idea that you're going to bring the rook to f8 and capture the queen. So king to g1 is basically forced. You're trying to waste another move with the king, but you cannot be pinned. And then rook f8 anyway, and suddenly black is just doing much better in this position. I mean, if you play just some random move like queen to g3, it's already completely lost. This is actually mate in 2 already. And you can feel free to pause the video and see if you can find a mate in 2 here. It's actually not that complex. You just have a check, and moving out of the way is impossible. So this is very difficult to play on the white side, and on the black side it's very easy to play. As I said, this rook is not coming out anytime soon, and you're basically up a piece, plus the location of your pieces is extremely good. This didn't happen in the game, and this was the reason why, instead of when bishop took the knight here, instead of bishop takes bishop here, which would have run into the sequence with knight to f6 and those attacks where you sacrifice the exchange, rather than recapturing here, white played a bishop to b6, attacking the queen. But that doesn't save white, because the game continued simply with queen to c8. Now queen to c8 sets up a double attack on the bishop on c2. And actually recapturing here is impossible, because now it's even worse. Now you have this check with a tremendous fork on the king and the rook. And in fact, at least one rook will be captured in this situation. So this is the position is very devastating and very lost for white. So you cannot allow such a fork, so that means you cannot take this. And you have to do something about the threat of the fork, but also you cannot leave the bishop hanging. So really the only move is to play rook to c1, and that's what white player did. But you have queen to c3 check anyway, and now simply an elegant series of moves. So after this, queen d2, and just take the queen, and simply bishop to h6 check, skewering the king and the rook here. So with the attack on the rook, after the king moves, the rook will be captured. And this is a completely lost position, because even after that, you pick up a couple of pawns here on the back rank. For example, king d1, bishop takes rook, king takes bishop, then capturing on c2, and this is just a dead lost endgame with a crushing material advantage for black. For this reason, after bishop to h6 check, Nashmadinov's opponent resigned the game. But I hope you enjoyed today's presentation, and especially its emphasis on why it's important to complete your development and to castle before starting some kind of attack. It's much more important to develop your pieces and to have momentum than to worry about temporary material disadvantages. So white here was at one point up 2 pawns, but this idea of this knight capturing on a7 was simply premature. And it was premature because white has yet to castle and white didn't complete his development. So rather than seeking this attack, white would have done better to just play g3, bishop g2 castle, maybe even castling on the queen side, although that's more questionable. But certainly the bishop should have been developed before such an attack took place. So I hope you enjoyed your presentation. I hope you learned about how to organize an attack with the black pieces in the old Indian defense. And I hope to see you here next time for more Nashmadinov goodness. Thank you very much. Konstantin out.